welcome to my podcast on real relationships. My name is Sophie Passon and I am a relationship expert, international speaker and best-selling author of the book, Your Other Half. I decided to start this podcast because, in my opinion, relationships are currently not being portrayed as what they really are. Whether you're watching the news or TV, social media, the perception given to people is wrong. And my aim is to talk about what happens in the real world, talk about real stories, and listen to what real people think, do, or go through, as opposed to creating expectations of something that doesn't actually exist. I may not agree with everything that is said by my guests, but it is their chance to express their opinions and their stories. And here today we have Andrew Payne, and we are going to talk about domestic abuse. Hi, Andrew.
Yeah, a nice light topic to get us.
But I think that the one thing that people would be surprised about is normally domestic abuse. We think that it's the man abusing the woman as opposed to the woman abusing the man, but that's not quite the case here. So
yeah, I mean, the language at the moment around domestic abuse, I mean, I think it is being challenged, but you hear the phrases, the overwhelming majority of cases of domestic abuse are men abusing women. And that simply isn't true, actually. If you look at the statistics, certainly the greater proportion of victims of domestic abuse are women abused by men, but roughly the stats as far as we have it from the Office of National Statistics is that a third of victims of domestic abuse are actually men, 2/3 are women, and within that breakdown, of course, on both sides you also have victims of abuse that are men being abused by men and women.
I was just about to mention that.
Female. Yeah.
A friend of mine was abused and she is gay, so it was woman by woman.
And you'll never see stories of women abusing women in that way in the press. You'll see stories of men abusing women. Occasionally, in some of the more, should I say, right-wing press, the Sun, the Mail, they do run the occasional stories on men being abused by women. But what you see as well in the kind of the higher level political discussions where real funding is commissioned, that the only people taking part in those discussions are women. Even though a third of victims are men, there are groups, really credible, well-run groups that support male victims of domestic abuse. They're never invited to the table to really participate in those discussions in the same way. And so there is a bit of a view that it is a sort of a sewn-up industry, and it doesn't suit some of the bigger women's organisations to open up the discussion because, of course, loss of funding and all that kind of stuff. And we haven't even yet discussed the fact that the cases of children abusing parents is massively on the increase, and that is also domestic abuse. Takes up a lot of time in the police. There have been reports in the press about how prevalent that's become. So my passion in speaking out about my own experiences is to try and do what I can within my small world to create a wider debate about domestic abuse that covers all the angles and remembers it's not just men abusing women, although obviously there are women suffering appalling things at the hands of men. Let's not take away from that. So
tell us a little bit about yourself first.
Yeah, well, I mean, now I'm happily remarried and I've rebuilt my life, but and I started talking about my experience of domestic abuse after I finished sort of in the family courts years later. And so in my former marriage, my ex-wife was very violent, very abusive, and I was married to her for 9 years, from 1999 to 2008. So it's quite a long time later that I'm beginning to talk about it. I don't think it's taken me that long to repair particularly, but I think that's partly reflected in just I was then tied up in the family courts for many years, as many men and women are, where there are abusive relationships and there are children involved. Once that relationship breaks down, it's going to go to court because the abusive parent will generally try and manipulate the children, and a whole new game of psychological warfare begins. So the abuse for me was 1990 to 2008. It was in a former marriage.
So tell us how it happened. How did it start? Did you cotton onto it straight away, so to speak, or how did it go?
Well, that's a good question. And my view on this is there tends to be, from what I can see, two common ways that people fall into abuse. You've got people that are genuinely conned. You know, the abuser is hugely attentive and charming, and so everything's wonderful. And then it just gradually deteriorates the relationship. And sometimes that part of that con is, I mean, as a friend of mine who's a female, he was great. And then after they got married, he just turned. It was almost like as soon as they'd sort of off the aisle, things went wrong. She was conned. But I think there's another way into abuse that's just as common, which is where you go in with your eyes wide open, you know the other person is trouble, but often people that want to help other people maybe don't have strong boundaries of their own. They're absolute suckers for abusive relationships because you want to help, you want to rescue, you want to help love the person so that they become a better version of themselves. You don't have boundaries, and then you get sucked into this madness. And then usually abusive people are very good at sort of gaslighting and making you think that it's your fault, making you doubt your own intuition and what's going on. That's what's called is what gaslighting is. And so it's very easy then to get stuck because, you know, people would say, well, surely just leave. Like, if it's that bad, just walk away. But, you know, particularly if there's no children. But if you genuinely believe that the abuse is your fault, that you deserved it, that you keep provoking your partner and you need to become this better person so that you can help your partner overcome their difficulties, then leaving becomes more complicated because you think it's your fault. You're not going to leave. You're just going to try harder to make the relationship work. And so that's why, you know, partly why some people
that's what happened in your case.
Initially, well, I thought it was my fault. My ex-wife was very, very good at twisting things around. And then whenever I kind of raised concerns about maybe the way she was acting, it always came back. It was my fault. And I always felt so bad about it. And there was always such a storm, often accompanied by violence, that I started to just fear her kicking off. And so then my life became about just whatever you do, minimize the risk of her kicking off. And so again, people in abuse can become obsessive planners because you're forever planning the day. What could go wrong? What do I need to do to navigate my way around this little problem? You're planning to ridiculous detail.
And one thing I found interesting, because I was in an emotionally abusive relationship, and it's how many people around you see that but don't say anything because they don't want to get involved, they don't want to interfere. But when you already have your own doubts, if 35 people, you know, that came out afterwards saying that they thought there was something amiss, I told you at the time, surely it would help you to realise that it's not you.
Yeah, I think, and you know, I think awareness is growing. Obviously, domestic abuse has been in the press a lot with the new domestic abuse bill going through. I think awareness is growing that actually men can be victims too. Mm-hmm. And I think we're in a different place. So back in 2000, when I was caught in abuse, you know, I was going to work regularly with sort of cuts and scratches on my face where my wife was attacking me. And I'd always say, my colleagues would be like, hey, you know, what's up with your face? And it was always a shaving accident. And that was never queried. But I genuinely think in the workspaces that I see today, if someone kept coming in, a bloke or a woman with cuts and marks on their faces, I think with the awareness that we have today, 20 years later, I think questions would be asked. Are you okay? You know, and there's obviously, it's a brilliant thing that there's so much talk today about mental health and talking about it. And that's a growing thing, which can only help.
And do you think that, you know, one of the issues as well is admitting to yourself that you're a man and it's a woman abusing you? Does that have an impact?
Well, I think there's several sides to that. It absolutely does. You know, I felt ashamed. You know, a real man wouldn't allow himself to get knocked. A real man would make his wife so happy that she wouldn't want to knock him about. And that was kind of the narrative running in my head. But I think, you know, we hear these terms, and I play a lot of football, so I hear it all the time, you know, in the changing rooms about manning up and don't be a big girl's blouse and have you got your kitchen pass so you can go out. And there's a lot of banter around that. And on the one hand, banter is okay in its place, but I don't think it's helpful to encourage men to say, actually, do you know what, I'm really struggling here. Because actually, where men do open up, from what I've seen, other men do listen and like, oh man, you know, that.
It's just having inverted brackets the courage to come out with it.
To absolutely come out with it. And I think some of it is the whole thing we need to change. And again, we're getting better. You know, boys don't cry, encouraging our boys to be brave. If they fall over and they're crying, you know, they're having a tantrum, you know, belt up, shut up, you know, stop making a fuss. Whereas actually, you know, sometimes, sure, you know, I've got 3 boys under 8, they make a tantrum, they're creating. But actually, well, why are they making a tantrum? You know, trying to listen to them, you see, what I do every night with my boys is I encourage them to share something that made them feel sad that day as well as something that made them feel happy, so that they can just get used to talking about the feelings when those feelings are maybe a bit negative and not so great. And we need to have this kind of, we need to change things from start to finish, because we do know that men speaking out is hugely underreported. And even from my own experiences since my TEDx talk came out in January on domestic abuse, I've been shocked genuinely by how many women have direct messaged me saying it happened to my son, happened to my brother, happened to my partner. He didn't say anything at the time, but was left in a really bad way. And you start to think, blimey, this is hugely underreported. And I wonder whether, as men start speaking out more, which we are, and as the mental health campaign continues to deliver over the years ahead, I wonder whether the stats will change. I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether they become more even. There's a lot of people that argue that actually it's a 50-50 split. It's just that men are much less likely to report. And the other side why men are less likely to report is not just the shame factor, although it is that, but it's also the fear that they won't be taken seriously by the authorities, or the fear. For me, I felt if I came out towards the end of the relationship, I was like, if I come out reporting domestic abuse, my ex-wife will immediately, well, she was my wife at the time, she'll immediately report domestic abuse, and she'll be much more believable because she's such a good liar. And so, that's another reason why men don't report. And the other reason why men don't report, particularly at the end of a relationship, is if there are kids involved, all you want to do is to diffuse the flames and tension, because if you're walking away from that abuser will create havoc for you. They will not let you get away easily. It may be that they let you go, but then they just cause chaos with your contact with the kids. It may be that they emotionally manipulate you so you don't go. But so men leaving domestic abuse, they're not going to report it to the police, because they're thinking already about, well, how's this going to play out with the kids? They're trying to keep everything as peaceful as possible. So for some of those reasons, men don't report. And that's partly why there are less stories in the press, because the national press will only report on stories where there's a secured conviction. Now, I understand why they would do that, but men are much less likely to secure a conviction, which is why there's so many less stories to share in the national press about male victims of domestic abuse.
And do you think there's a particular type of victim?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, the two ways into abuse, I was someone that I wanted to help people. Definitely people that like to be helpful can be victims. People without boundaries, I mean, that is huge now. You see, I'm still quite a helpful person. I like to help people. But coming out of abuse, I sort of created my own models for myself of how to develop my boundaries, because I wanted to still be a nice person. I didn't want to become a jerk, but I knew that I needed to toughen up across the board, in all relationships. It was a pattern that I just sort of rolled over. I was a bit of a doormat, really. And so I think people that do roll over very easily, that don't have strong boundaries, and they like helping people, that they are absolutely cannon fodder for abusive relationships.
And do you think that your ex-wife would do it again to a man?
Well, that's an interesting point. So for my daughters that still have contact with her, in the relationships where they've been very volatile, the relationships, they themselves haven't seen her be violent towards those men, but they've been volatile relationships. And then when the relationship's broken down, she has reported domestic abuse in every single case. Right. So maybe she's just unlucky. Maybe she's making it up. But there is a pattern there. There's a pattern. And I suspect, people often say, well, does my ex-wife have mental health issues? Probably. Probably from what I now know, I'm not an expert, it looks to me like a sort of a borderline personality disorder. But with a lot of these things, you'll never really get to the bottom of what the problem is.
There's a few reasons why people abuse others. There's obviously the mental health side of things. There's sometimes just like past trauma. And they literally, I've got a problem that's arisen from that, and they take it out on everybody else. There's also people who just kind of want help. They know they've got a problem, but they're just not doing anything about it. And I think there's so many different reasons as to why it happened.
Yeah, definitely there are. And you can't really pigeonhole. It's not fair to pigeonhole. It would be wrong to say that everybody that is abusive has a mental health issue. It would be wrong to say everyone that's abusive is an arsehole. That would be wrong entirely. You know, as you rightly say, many people that abuse carry a lot of pain from previous experiences. So just as there are different types of victims and there's definitely different types of abusers, but certainly from the relationships that she's had since, it would appear that they have been very volatile. And like I say, she has reported in each case domestic abuse. Yeah.
So what made you like kind of realize, hang on a minute, this isn't right, I need to go? What
it
was a trigger? Was there something that happened?
Yeah.
Kicked into place?
There were a few triggers, and normally it's not just one thing as an isolated thing. So 2006, we live in the south of France, and I mentioned this is how I open up my TEDx story, actually, with the story of where my ex-wife had stabbed me with a pencil, of all things. It was a hot summer's day. We were living in the south of France, in a beautiful rural town, and you didn't used to lock your front door in that part of France. And she was very pally with an English neighbor, an older lady, and the older lady heard the commotion and burst through our front door as my ex-wife was stabbing me in the arm with a pencil. There's a lot of blood all over my arm. And she sort of ushered my now ex-wife next door to calm her down. And that neighbor talked to me quietly later and said, she's very well spoken, do you realize this is domestic abuse, Andrew? And I remember her saying it to me. And I remember thinking, really? Yeah. You know, crazy, really, with all the madness and the violence.
By pencils to a degree, aren't you? It's just another day, different day, but another day.
Yeah, I really hadn't considered myself to be the victim of domestic abuse, and I'd always thought it was my fault, so I never really gone there. And that definitely started a process of thinking, maybe, you know, this isn't right. You know, maybe should I put up with this? Should I not put it? I mean, by that time we had daughters, so I wasn't going to walk away. But I definitely think in those latter years, I was tiring of the drama and the histrionics, and what had been fear was beginning to turn towards contempt. That's how I was feeling. And I think once you feel contemptuous towards someone, there's no space for that relationship. There's nowhere for that relationship to go. In the end, actually, my ex-wife ended it. She actually kicked me out. And she started a relationship with someone else, which I didn't know at the time. So I sort of, like a good Christian boy, went to marriage guidance and all that kind of stuff for a few months to try and sort of sort it out. I hadn't realized she'd been seeing someone else, but that space, you know, although she'd ended it and kicked me out, within about a month, I was like, oh, I really like not living with her. And when I had my daughters, like, it's so much easier. Like, you'd have thought with one parent it'd be harder, but no, it's like, this is really easy. Having my daughters is a breeze. Because the real problem is not here with me now. And so then when my ex-wife ended, well, she didn't end that, when that relationship, however it ended with this guy she was seeing, and she sort of came back to me and wanted to patch it up, I was done. And so perhaps had I not had that space to experience life outside that, maybe I'd still be there today. I don't know. I was always very nervous of leaving because of the girls.
And what about the girls? Did she ever abuse them?
Well, in the time that we were together, very much so emotionally. She was a real rotten bully, and they both, you know, they're 16 and 19 now, and they both will say how scared they were. Like, really, like, sometimes you can be wary of a parent, and some level of respect is okay and not a bad thing, but real fear, constantly on edge. And she was more shouty, screamy, but like putting her nose against their nose, and, you know, really threatening to throw all their toys in the bin. Like, she'd pack up the black bin liner and they'd be sobbing and begging. She'd be walking out to the dust, and then she wouldn't at the last minute, you know, because they hadn't tidied their bedroom or something like that.
So not for anything drastic, but been really naughty sort of thing.
Yeah, she was quite cruel with the parental control that a parent naturally has. She didn't actually physically attack them. The violence was definitely reserved for me. But so after the marriage, and I think we may come on to this in our kind of next conversation around the family court, she did attack my eldest when she was 10. Only once. It was quite a bad attack. Social services got involved. So she has been violent towards them, but most of the abuse towards my daughters was sort of controlling, bullying kind of a thing.
And as much as I hate the term narcissist, because I do generally feel that too many people use it.
It's become a bit of a buzzword, hasn't it? Narcissist.
It's
Everywhere.
They say, oh, there's such a person as a narcissist. I'm thinking, no, they're not. They just don't want you. That's the way it stops, you know? So I don't like the term because I think it covers too many things. But it is a thing. It does exist. Would you say that she was one of those, or?
Yeah, I mean, like you, I personally think the word narcissistic is quite helpful if you're talking about narcissistic tendencies rather than just labeling someone as narcissistic. So there's definitely narcissistic tendencies, an absurd level of self-belief and self-importance that is somewhat is gobsmacking, really. Very, very delusional. There is no, you know how even people that are quite hard to work with, if you have a problem with maybe something they've done or the way they are, you can probably still have a conversation about it. You might be treading on eggshells a bit, but you can still make progress from having had a conversation.
And
but with a
person would be like, you're nasty to me.
Yeah. So there is absolutely, and I read this about
nasty. The result of the reaction.
Yeah.
He portrays it so well with him.
Yeah, he's a great example. Listen, he's a great example. There is actually no point in
trying
crossing
to explain it.
All you can do, if you're going to stay in that relationship, then you need to understand. You need to, I don't know. I don't know how you'll keep your sanity, but really, you can't argue. You can't change them. You can't influence them. Any conversation you have with them about how they could do things differently is an absolute waste of time. And so, yes, I think my ex-wife definitely has the narcissistic tendencies, a lot of similarities with Mr. Trump, who, but yeah. So, and I think a lot of abusers do have those narcissistic tendencies where they are the center of the world. The world must revolve around them. And if there's any suggestion or indication that it doesn't, then they don't react very well to it.
And then obviously there's an element of manipulation. As you said, there's manipulating how you felt, that it was your fault. But it's power, isn't it? Manipulation is power.
Yeah. And listen, we all manipulate. Listen, I was manipulative.
Of course.
As the victim of domestic abuse, trying to constantly manipulate and avoid those triggers being pulled. Thinking back, some of my behavior was ridiculous. And you can become quite untruthful. You can lack integrity as a victim of domestic abuse because you'll do anything to keep the peace. You'll sell your granny to keep the peace if you had to.
And I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute. I'm just going to share a story and then ask you a difficult question.
No, that's cool. Go do it. I like difficult questions.
So there was a guy I was seeing for a while, years and years ago, and he was possibly the most laid-back person I've ever met. Either way, one day we're just having a conversation about exes or whatever, and he said he'd been seeing this girl for about 6 weeks, and he said every single person that she had been with had actually abused her, either physically or emotionally, but more often than not, physically. And he couldn't understand why at all. He had never touched a woman in that way before or anything. And then one day he realized that she was pushing his buttons so much that he was close to actually punching her. So he moved that way, not moved out, we were not living together, but he moved away and went out and then decided to end it because he thought if she's triggering that response in me, there's definitely something about her here because I'm not that kind of person ever. I've never done it. So he walked away. But I found it quite a fascinating conversation to have at the time. And I wasn't even doing any of what I'm doing now. But would you say that you played a part in it sometimes?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the part that I played, I didn't have boundaries. I played along as a victim. I was so scared of her and wrapped up in that fear and keeping the peace that I struggled to see beyond that. And, I didn't have any goals of my own or ideas or ambition. It was just managing her. Mm-hmm. And I became very one-dimensional. So I think for me, an abusive relationship is like a grotesque partner dance that's not funny to watch. It's awkward to watch. It's horrible to watch. But there are two players in that grotesque dance, unfortunately. I also think the thing you raise about violence is interesting. You know, I've never hit a woman, thankfully, and I never hit in the end, I didn't ever hit my ex-wife, but I definitely thought about it, you know, and I do think there are some people that are very, very good at goading others, getting you to a point where you explode, and then they're like, what's wrong? Well, I can't believe you're being like this.
Yeah,
And yet they have pushed every button. And that goes on, you know, and abusive people can do that, as you know, that's a common weapon that they utilize, really pushing and goading the victim, and then kind of stepping back and usually you'll see this where the victim will have their meltdown moment in public, so others can see that the victim really isn't someone that's holding it together.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any regrets?
I mean, obviously, if I had my time again, you know, I wouldn't have got sucked into that relationship. It's very difficult to have regrets, though, where you've got children with someone, because that would be like saying, well, I don't want them to exist, and I don't.
Not necessarily like that, but maybe leaving earlier or...
Yeah, no, I don't at all. I think it would have been hard to have left earlier with my daughters. I don't have any regrets. Obviously, I'm really happily married now. And I also think that some of what I experienced, because I was a bit of I didn't have clear boundaries and all that kind of stuff, coming out of that relationship, I definitely wouldn't be the person I am today, having not had those experiences. So I don't wish that I'd never had those experiences. So I'm quite at peace. No regrets.
Yeah, it's not something you'd go back through in a hurry, but at the same time, you can see how you contributed to your growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we're getting towards the end of our time together. So what I would ask you next is, if there's someone listening at the moment who's got doubts and thinking, are they abusing me? Are they not? What advice would you give them?
Don't run that past the person that you think might be abusing you, because they'll just turn it back on yourself. But do talk to someone that's outside that relationship that will hold your confidence, and start talking to someone. It may, some relationships are quite difficult. It doesn't necessarily mean the person's abusive. I've seen relationships where actually man hits woman and woman hits man, you know, and they're dysfunctional, and maybe that's still, well, should I be in that relationship? I'm not sure. But I think whether it's a dysfunctional relationship or whether it's truly an abusive relationship where one particular party is an absolute bully, if you're in that and you've got doubts, and then you need to talk to someone outside the relationship that you can trust, and do talk. Do not keep it to yourself because of pride or fear, or, you know, because anybody can be caught in an abusive relationship. It doesn't mean you're weak or stupid. Anybody can, you know, all types of. So just don't keep it to yourself. Do talk to someone.
Right, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And that's all we've got time for today. Thanks again. And for everybody else, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe, leave us a review, and more importantly, come back for the next episode. Thank you.